like to discuss submission this morning. This was something I started working on a number of weeks ago. And my first draft was kind of a whirlwind tour of everything I could possibly hit on the subject. And so I started cutting and trying to eliminate as much as I could to get down to some basics, primarily for me, because I was looking at the topic for my purposes, regardless of the sermon. And thought, you know what, maybe just some building block stuff would be a helpful reminder. So I don't want to presume too much one way or the other. However, there's a lot of this that might be almost too obvious, and I'm not going to take a terribly long time. It's just going to be some of the absolute fundamental concepts of what submission is, and hopefully you'll be able to glean something from that or have a reminder as to why that is important. And so I worked on this for a number of weeks, and then last week we were camping out in Niagara, and on Thursday, I spent some time on this off and on throughout the week, and on Thursday, I kind of wrapped it up to a point where I thought I was done, and I had no more to add. And I didn't add anything to this, but on Thursday, some friends of mine decided to hike down to what's called the Niagara Whirlpool, and 2 miles south or 2 miles downriver of Niagara Falls. There's a point at which the river makes a right-hand turn. And it opens up into this massive swirling hole. It's a hole, deepest part of the river, and you have to go down the side of the gorge to get there. You know me, I'm not a fan of exercise of any kind whatsoever, But I thought, what's once a year, works out to that. And so I'll go on. So I took Elliot and Joshua, and as we parked and we're walking along the rim of the gorge and about to head down, you turn to go down some steps. And as we're turning, this fellow comes up alongside me, and he's young and fit and sweating profusely. And I have Joshua on my back, and Elliot's holding my hand. I thought, you know what? I'm going to regret this before I'm done. And it took an hour and a half to get down there, and it's 350 steps to the bottom of the staircase. And then you walk another 45 minutes or so to get back upriver to the whirlpool. And it was pretty, and it was nice. However, before I was at the bottom of the steps the first time, I thought, why did I submit myself to this? Why did I subject myself to this? And all this to say that subjection or submission, in terms of taking yourself and putting you under a certain situation, it happens all the time. It's kind of a basic concept that we operate under in every sense, all the time, every minute of every day. By the time I got back up, I was really kicking myself because, I did not want to do that. I don't care if it was at the bottom anymore. I'd seen that I was done, and never again, at least until perhaps next year. So, those sorts of situations occur where you find yourself in submission to something, perhaps by your own choice, perhaps not. Perhaps easily, perhaps not. Submission is everywhere. So I wanted to back up and look at submission in its most basic forms. And again, I should not probably take terribly long with this. So to show submission, this is a bit of an overview of some of these concepts. I'd like to discuss with the idea that submission is necessarily apparent. And I apologize if this concept is so obvious it need not be spoken. If you look in James 2 for a minute, in the conversation about faith, he makes this point that faith without works is dead. Beginning in verse 14, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving the things they need for their body, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. So show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And his point here is, look, you claim to have faith, but what good is it if it cannot be seen? It must be visible, it must be active to do any good at all. And I would suggest that is the same with submission. If I may play with it a minute, submission without evidence is dead. You can claim to be submissive, but if it is not apparent in your behavior, you aren't actually at all. And so that's what I'm bringing this up. Let's consider this as a parallel here. Just like faith without works is dead, submission without evidence is dead. So I'm going to try to back that up. This is a principle across all inspired law. Before the law of Moses, in Abraham, we see this concept that submission requires evidence. So if you look at Genesis 22, we're going to bounce down in the middle here of where the Lord commands that Abraham go and sacrifice his son. He's packed everything up. He's heading out to the place that God had told him to go. And it says in verse 9 of Genesis 22, when they, that is Abraham and Isaac at least, came to the place of which God had told Abraham, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Okay? This was visible submission. Yeah, God, I'll submit to you. I will do those things. Eventually, maybe, it's in my heart, I shouldn't need to do more. Yeah, if you actually required this of me, I would do it, but I'm guessing it's a test. You probably don't. There is not submission. Seeing, and notice that his faith and submission were in a sense one and the same here, right? He had the faith that he needed to do this, and the submission was a necessary part of that. Another example during the Old Law, 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 12. This is Rehoboam here, after his kingdom is established. If you begin in verse 1, when the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong, he abandoned the law of the Lord, and all Israel with him. So at one point he might have been in submission, but now he is not. He's abandoned the law of the Lord, and all Israel with him. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen. And the people were without number who came with him from Egypt, Libyans, Sukkim, and Ethiopians. And he took the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. So he's already went in here. Then Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and said to the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak, and said to them, Thus says the Lord, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak. Then the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, The Lord is righteous. And when the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah. They have humbled themselves. I will not destroy them. I will grant them some deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem by the hand of Shishak. The Lord relents here when he sees submission take place. Hearts. That is, I suppose, a possibility because he can read the heart. However, I suspect there was behavior associated with that because they had abandoned his law and now are humbling themselves. In this instance, God sees that and changes his mind. Consider marriage, as is mentioned in 1 Peter 3. A little bit different a situation here. Before we're talking about God seeing the submission of those under him. Now we're talking about another human being seeing the submission of a fellow human being. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. So how do you know that a woman is respectful and pure and is in submission? It is visible. It is visible. Submission is necessary, apparent. So conversely, one might say, submission is obvious when it is absent. Is it not? And we are more used, I think, to calibrating our minds in this direction than not. It can be pretty apparent pretty quickly for us when submission is not occurring, perhaps even more so than when it is. Rebellion is easy to identify because submission is visible. In other words, this point wouldn't be necessary. If submission could happen without it being visible, then how would you know when rebellion was occurring? Right? So if one must be the case, if we can recognize rebellion, that means we can recognize the opposite. Submission, therefore, must be visible. There's kind of an argument from logic there. But consider some instances where rebellion occurs, the calf in Exodus 32. The Lord said to Moses, Go down, for your people, whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I them, and they have made for themselves a golden calf, and have worshipped it, and sacrificed to it, and said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, It is a stiff-necked people. Okay? What's his point? Now, God can see the Israelites' hearts, and he knows what's brewing there as Moses is up on the mountain. But he provides evidence that Moses can see physically to prove what is in them. This stiff-necked attitude was something that became apparent to Moses when it was shown through their behavior. They were no longer submissive, and it was obvious visibly. Jonah. So again, God sees the unrighteousness, shows it to Moses. Moses sees it as well. Consider Jonah. Jonah rejects God's commands, gets on the boat to escape. The storm is brought up, and the men on the boat are trying to decide what it is that's going on here, right? So they pinpoint Jonah, and they say in verse 10, the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Jonah says, I have a God, and I have not been submissive. And the men who are, so far as we know, I'll say unrighteous, okay, as I said up here, identify, whoa, if you're unsubmissive to somebody to whom you are supposed to be submissive, there are consequences to you. So these might not be followers of God in the same way that Jonah was intended to be, but they recognize that if you should be submissive, you better be submissive. And they're afraid for their own safety because of this, and they can't believe what Jonah has done because they recognize the principle. Submission is necessary. Just see it too. Consider the young widows in 1 Timothy. Where do I have this on here? I'm going to pull it up on this. Let me bounce back and forth a little bit here. So again, submission is obvious when discussing women whose husbands have died. They're now widows, which means at least that they no longer have a husband to whom they need to submit, right? And what might happen to them if they don't remarry? You'll be able to identify certain behaviors. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going from house to house, and not only idlers, but gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their own household, and give no adversary an occasion for slander. So say what you want about perhaps some of the more less sensitive ways that this is being approached here in terms of today's sensibilities, including the fact that to have children at a home means that you are busy instead of a busybody. You now have a husband to whom you are submitting, and without that, human nature is inclined to start getting into trouble. Without that, from 1 Timothy 5. So, consider, these are some examples of how we see that submission is very noticeably lacking when we sit here. But consider how it shows itself just with anybody, regardless of your status, whether you're a wife submitting to a husband, whatever. Practical application in our behavior and attitudes. The Bible talks about us submitting to one another. If you've ever heard the phrase, you have no right to require me to insert whatever, we have, at the very least, an attitude problem. It could be, I'm assuming we're discussing Christians here. I'll leave it at that for the moment. You have no right to require me to fill in the blank. So this could be, this person who is saying that could be stating this to somebody who truly does have no right, but this is still not a submissive attitude. In other words, you have no right to expect my submission. But as I'll try to detail later, and this is why I'm bringing it up now so that we can kind of keep this thought as we go through, you can have a submissive attitude towards anybody. If it's a Christ-like attitude, look, somebody comes to me and says you're doing this incorrectly, I may not have to submit to them. But if they're bringing to me a concern about the word, look, you're not submitting to Christ in this way. My attitude towards them should not be this. It should not be this. So just keep that in mind as we continue here. There we go. So what is submission? Submission is yielding to authority. Authority is granted, not earned. I suppose there's instances in which authority might be earned. I couldn't really think of what those would be off the top of my head. Even a person who is in authority and has worked their way to that. Let's say you get a job on the ground floor, all right? And you start working your way up. Well, you might have earned that to some extent, but there's the boss in front of you that said, look, you are worthy of this, and I am granting it to you. It's still handed to you in some sense. So authority is granted, I won't say absolutely, but generally not earned. But submission is still necessary, and we can't submit unless there's an authority there. We can't just submit to nothing. There must be an entity to which we are submitting, right? So, some examples of this, and I'll go through this quickly. In fact, these might be all the examples of where submission is a matter of yielding to authority. Colossians 3:20 discusses the parent and child. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Well, there you are. You have the authority, and you have the one who must submit to that authority. I have unfortunately learned in the past 5-6 years that the authority of a parent is certainly not earned. It is certainly I'm glad I didn't realize it until I was a parent. That's definitely an advantage. The child learning to submit. The parent does not earn that authority by some sort of merit. It is granted to them by God and the system He sets in place for us. Ephesians 5:22, another hard one to learn. I actually have 22 down here, but in my notes I say 24. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Do husbands always merit? Do they ever merit submission? Perhaps not. But that's not what is a matter of concern here. Indeed, the wife is supposed to submit regardless, because that authority has been granted to him. Colossians 3:22, bumping back up. The slave and the master, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So we see the slave master, say the employee and employer. In some instances, this might be a case where you have chosen to submit yourself because you have asked for the job. In some instances, you might be the slave. Regardless of that, submission is necessary until the situation changes, regardless of whom you are working for, right? And then, of course, the government and the citizen. I say these aren't all examples, because, of course, there is our submission to Christ, and I will cover that in a bit later. Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That's verse 1. So all instances in which authority has been granted to a particular person or entity, and those who are under that authority must submit regardless of the merit of the authority. That being the case, we have to recognize that submission is an act of love. A funny one, and particularly now, it doesn't seem like we treat submission in that way, but it is true. John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, right? What does love look like? Among other things, perhaps, is submission. It is submission. And this becomes so much more relevant when you consider the fact that you submit due to what a person has been granted and not what they merit. Because if you're doing it because they deserve it, that means nothing for you. It's sort of like earning your salvation, right? If we were to be able to say we earned our salvation, what need have we for Christ? What good does that do us? In the same way, if we're submitting because they deserve that, we're only doing the very least. We should be prepared to submit to the authority when it is required of us, regardless of, and to do so is an act of love in that way. So, this is the only time I'm going to hit this, and there's a lot that could be said in terms of practical application, and indeed many of these things. An 8-slide slideshow might be the shortest I've ever had. Submission is only excused when sin is involved. That would no longer be an example. Acts 5:28. I'll begin in 27. The apostles are brought before the high priest because they have been doing the things the apostles should be doing. Brought in, set before the council, and the high priest saying, "Urge you not to teach in this name," that is the name of Jesus. "Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than man. So when there is conflict between two entities to which you are supposed to submit, you choose the righteous one, right? Or there might not be a righteous one. They want you to do the wrong thing. You cannot do that, so you submit. You try to remove yourself from that situation if possible. So, are they supposed to submit? Yes, they are. In this instance, was to, I'll say it this way, stop loving. Okay? There's the good news. It is their job to teach it as commanded to them by God. It is loving to teach it because the people already comes along and says you may not have an option. You're commanded to love, to submit to Christ. I'm sorry, I can't obey you in that way. And I think this would apply probably to any submissive situation. Only excuse when sin is involved. So, if you're supposed to submit, you are supposed to submit. But that authority does not have the power to ask you to. That is no longer an authority in that instance to which you are even required to submit, because Christ's authority is greater. Submission is also a matter of giving honor. So let me compare these really quickly. Yielding, these are all very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Yes, they're visible, but they're also literal, necessary things. You go here and do that. Okay, so you must go and do it. And now I'm transitioning to some more ceremonial, more of the attitude, more of the stuff going on in the heart, and more of things that we have come as societies to view as submissive. That isn't just doing the thing, but doing it in a particular way. Submission is more than just doing the thing. It is doing the thing with a good attitude and with respect. So, we give honor in our submission in word. Sarah is referred to in 1 Peter 3. Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. He's making the point here that, look, there's submission taking place here, but there's submission with ceremonial respect. There's honor here. He's been provided a title, okay, because he has been granted authority, and she recognizes that not just in what she does, but in the word, in the way that she approaches that. It also occurs in our prayer. Citizens are required to pray for the governing authorities in 1 Timothy 2. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high position, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So it's not simply a matter of doing as a government requests, but it's a matter of, I'll say wishing, but praying good for them at the same time. And this is absolutely necessary and less ceremonial, perhaps, but it is still not just doing the thing. It is referring to the attitude behind the act of submission. This occurs in body language as well. Esther, in chapter 5. Esther has learned of the problem. She has taken some time to consider her approach with the king. And she comes to the king, and I don't know exactly what their tradition was, but they had one. It's very apparent as you read through the history and even just that one. In verse 2 of chapter 5 of Esther, when the king saw Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in her hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So whatever is entailed there, if Esther had brushed it away and said, no, this is more important than the submissive, would the king have known that? Right? So she hasn't been asked to do anything here of the king. She needs to be submissive without having first found out what's expected of her. She's obeying Mordecai, obviously, but when it comes to her relationship with the king, there has been no commandment from him at this point. So what she does to convey submission is totally ceremonial. It's expected of her, and she does it, and she does it well. Also in dress, and forgive me here if I bounce over this quickly, because there's only so much I'm willing to say I know about this. If you consider the account of Nineveh, going back to Jonah. So, we were talking about Jonah a moment ago. He's thrown overboard, obviously swallowed by the fish, spat back up, and then told to try again. He goes to Nineveh, he preaches to Nineveh. What is the result of that? The people of Nineveh believed God. This is Jonah 3, verse 5. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth. from the greatest to the least. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. So, once you see at the end here, turn away from his evil. This is the practical side of submission here. Look, we haven't been submitting, and now we need to repent and change our behavior. But in this instance, it seemed right. There was cause for more ceremony than that, or a more obvious sense of repentance. It wasn't just a matter of, oops, sorry about that, I'm going to change my behavior. Okay, they're fasting. They're covering themselves in sackcloth and ashes. This is not one of the commandments of God. Ashes as part of your regular routine. This is something that they have chosen to do as a sign in their society at the very least that, look, we are submissive, we are repenting, we need to submit, we need to be obedient. In dress, they are communicating that to each other and to God. Consider the Nazirite vows. Now these were what we're looking for, optional. They were not compulsory, but those who wished to perform these vows, there was some standards by which they were supposed to communicate that. Verse 5 of Numbers 6. All the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall touch his head. Until the time is completed for which he separates himself to the Lord, he shall be holy. He shall let the locks of his hair of his head grow long. It's just interesting for me to see here, this is not a necessary part of the law. This is something a person has chosen to do, and if they've chosen to do this, one of the things they submit themselves to is an appearance that indicates they have submitted to this. He's a Nazirite. How do you know? I saw that he does the ceremonial things, that indicate he is such. This is an indication of submission. And indeed, 1 Corinthians 11, obviously there's some we don't all see the same about this, but in verse 5 at least, every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. I'll say for the sake of this conversation right now, I don't know exactly what's going on here. Maybe I know a little more, maybe I don't. I'm not sure, at least for now. However, that being the case, there's some sort of indication of some sort of submission by some sort of covering. It's there. That much is there. And so I would suggest, and that might be, there is no explicit commandment that says this exactly anywhere else. However, if nothing else, in a societal sense, there is something that we see going on here that is based upon the way a woman keeps herself, by clothing or hair or whatever. There is something definitely going on there. So, some of these might be somewhat more ceremonial. They are things that are required to simply show the sign that this is happening, that submission is occurring. But it is the case. So a little bit of application now. One of the things that was unique to me about this particular sermon, for me, you wouldn't know this unless I told you so, but usually my slides build off of each other, and in this instance, up until this morning, I kept on swapping the order they went in, because it didn't really matter to me. As I kept on working with it, it didn't matter. So in this instance, back up and remember all the instances that we were looking at in which these relationships require submission. The parent and the child, the husband and the wife, the employee and the employer, the slave and the master, and then our submission to the government. I'm backing up to that thought again. Submission is universally necessary. Children, obey your parents. If you think your parents don't have to experience submission, think again. And this is the thought process by which I began studying this at all. Because, and I can't remember what it was, and it's not important, something occurred with the children where it struck my mind that they believe submission, they experience submission as children to their parents, right? And they think that it's a particular malady of childhood. and is this not? If you think about it, this is true. We want to grow up, right? Because then we're able to do what we want to do, and it doesn't work out that way. And what a letdown when you realize that you're not going to escape it. It's always there. So if you think your parents don't have to experience submission, Think again. It's not occurring because you are a child. It's occurring because everybody experiences it. And that's where you're at right now. But you will not escape it. The wife submitting to the husband. If you think your husband doesn't have to experience submission, think again. And this is where we really start hitting some practical issues with the world, because the world, and I'm going to argue against this in a minute, but I'll just say for now, the world hates submission. The idea of a wife submitting to her husband is something that is railed against at every opportunity. But men have to submit too. It's just to something else. What are men only responsible to themselves? Perhaps that's where the root of the confusion is, that men behave that way. You know, I only answer to me, and my wife answers to me, and therefore I am above her. But that's not what we have. I am required to submit to many, many things, as my wife is to me. So if you think your husband doesn't have to experience submission, think again. I'm not saying this to suggest that nobody here believes this. Again, I was trying to be somewhat foundational. The husband, including many other things, has to submit to Christ. And husbands, if you think your wife and children should have an easier time submitting than you do, think again, because in this instance we have an advantage. I would far rather submit to Christ than to submit to anybody who makes mistakes like I do. But there we are in a situation where I have to remember that my wife and my children submit to me because I have been granted that authority, not because I deserve it. In the instance of myself and Christ, Christ absolutely deserves it. He always will and always has. So in that instance, you've got a woman that needs to. And of course, Christ must submit to the Father. If you think Christ's example of submission is not intended for you, think again. It is very much so. And so here I am having to remember this. If Christ can do this in this way, not only can I submit in the same way he did to his Father, I can to him. But I need to behave in such a way that my wife and children can to me. And that doesn't seem easy. It doesn't seem easy at all, but Christ did it. Christ did it. There is the example for us. And so we need to remember that when we see incredible examples of submission, in the high priestly prayer, in John 17, those sorts of things, we see incredible submission, by a man who deserves respect and honor. Okay? We need to be able to submit in the same way as well. As usual, however, the world has perverted this concept of submission. Let's look at this for a moment. So I just covered different relationships. I covered them again. It's been perverted. Children cannot be stifled by rules. Can I put the quote up here? I don't want to begin telling you where I've heard this even recently. Well, I will tell you. Better to learn in a safe environment at home. Okay? And this was a woman talking about sexual relationships that her daughter wants to have. Okay? Okay, as a coworker, okay. Well, they're going to do it anyway. They should have to be subject to this stuff, so I provide a safe environment for it to happen. Okay, and I've heard of this, but I haven't run into it myself. And so children can't be stopped. We can't make them submit to the parent. Okay, they're going to do what they're going to do anyway, so we may as well give up, is essentially what's going on here, and provide a safe environment, whatever that means. It's meaningless. Okay, but we hear this attitude, do we not? How can they learn submission if they do not see it practiced by their mother? Right, we're going to start backing our way up here. It needs to be learned. And it's going to be learned by example. So if I desire a submissive child, I need to display a submissive attitude in my functioning with Christ. Janice needs to do that in her interaction with me. Children can't be settled by rules. Well, here you've got parents who have no interest in teaching. Is what's going on here. Women cannot submit to a husband. The patriarchy. This word is relatively new use here, right? Past 10 years, maybe, like they've used patriarchy to describe the hierarchical. I mean, I recognize the word no longer, but in terms of application here, I feel like it's been a catchphrase just recently. The patriarchy. We can't tolerate this anymore. A woman cannot submit to a husband. That is unfair. It is below her. But she's allowed to go to work and submit to a boss. She's liberated when she does that. She's gone from submitting to a person who has publicly stated his desire to love her and care for her, to trading her submission for money. Okay, now, I don't necessarily see a problem with trading your submission. However, the world does. The world sees money as a huge problem when it comes to this sort of thing. And basically what? I would think the world would see that as selling yourself out. they don't. There's some strong inconsistencies here, and so here we are. Women cannot submit to a husband, but she's liberated to submit to a workplace authority. I don't understand it. How can she learn submission if it is not practiced by her husband? Okay? That's the pattern we have going here. But men shouldn't be bound by religion. And I say men here, they apply to everybody, but I'm trying to build a tree a little bit. So, the woman's so busy practicing submission in the workplace, the child in the home. The woman's not there to learn it from her husband because man doesn't have to submit to anything anymore. So you take out religion and suddenly these things start falling apart, do they not? But they should be bound by a manufactured oath of justice. Right? No, we throw out the Bible. But suddenly in the past 10 or 12 years, or 6 months, we've learned that sexual assault is wrong. Right? And that's an invention of ours. I don't mean that, I'm being sarcastic here, but society has just tolerated this for a while, and now we're not going to. Well, it was never tolerated. But we've thrown it all away. We said we weren't subject to this. We would not submit to this. We put ourselves into a bunch of trouble because we said, well, we're not going to be held down by God's expectations for us, so we're allowed to do things that we're not supposed to. Okay? Women struggle to learn. Children struggle to learn. We don't develop, right? And so here we are now in a situation where none of us has any practice doing anything for the right reason. And society comes along and tells us, well, that's not right. Thank you for showing up and telling me how this is supposed to work. How can you learn submission if Christ's example is mocked? Right? We start doing that, and it all starts falling apart. So consider for a moment. The world demands and exalts the concept of submission. They love it. They love it as much as you hear otherwise. The world loves submission, as long as it's to them. Right? It's not really a matter of a woman shouldn't obey her husband. No, it's a matter of that's what God expects, and we hate God. They hate God. Okay? And so then we create this cascade of poor attitudes, bad reasoning, little knowledge, and suddenly nobody's submissive to anything. And it's chaos. It's a mess. It's interesting to see here how the idea of submission, when in God's hands, builds a functioning and perfect model of how we're to behave. But then you take God out of it and take the very same concept and hand a command, and it destroys it. It destroys it. This is indeed the struggle between good and evil. That's all it is evil wanting your submission and good wanting your submission. That's really all that's going on here. And I'm almost done. Of submission plus the attitude. Therein you find obedience. Submissive action is clearly necessary. We illustrated that a moment ago. Action with a rebellious heart is worth very, very little. Some examples. Remember, inevitably inward rebellion becomes outward rebellion. If you look at Proverbs 4, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. From your heart flows everything. And if your heart starts rebelling, it will start showing in your actions eventually too. 2 Corinthians, I have it down wrong here. 2 Corinthians, let me see if I can find that. I have to check myself. I see what I did wrong. Yeah, it is. I think this is right. 2 Corinthians 10:5. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. We must captivate our thoughts if our behavior is supposed to emulate God's expectations of us. So, we are required to submit, and the question is, can we muster up the sincerity to do it? Because if we're doing it insincerely, we're not submitting at all. It is true that submission is apparent. If you are faking it, it is still apparent, it's just not apparent yet. That's all that's going on here. We do not have the capacity to see it at first. But if you have an unsubmissive attitude, yet submissive actions, one day it catches up. It always will. For example, can a covered woman, again, whatever that means, can a covered woman be rebellious? Well, I would suggest, yes. I'm showing my submission visibly in what I'm doing. But can you identify, perhaps in some people, a rebellious attitude? I would suggest you can. Here's a more relevant or a more recent one. Can Anonymous, can Anonymous tell the world he is actively undermining the President of the United States and still be submissive? He can. He's fooling a lot of people right now who know him. This is the editorial I'm talking about. There's an inside act that is essentially not submissive. Now, regardless of what you think of that particular situation and why it's going on, the point is this, okay? Here's a man who has authority. He may not merit it. I'm not arguing that at all, okay? But the President of the United States has had authority granted to him. He does not merit it. Fine. Whatever. Okay? We have men and women, people who are supposed to submit to him in his agenda, I'll say, right? Okay? And the anonymous here is tricking the president into thinking he's submissive. But he's not. And he's admitted it. And this is great. Yeah. But it's great to see it illustrated. So obviously, look, it looks like submission, but it's actually not. And one day, it's going to become obvious that it's not. So now the president is probably out there looking. I'm sure he is. You know, who is behaving in such a way that I can see that indicates that their heart is not submissive to what I'm asking of them. Right? We recognize this is why there's chaos right now about this. This is why this is such a big deal, because there's people that are rebelling against that to whom they are supposed to submit. Okay? And we're seeing it happen before our eyes here in a big way, a bigly way, right? So, can Anonymous tell the world he's actively undermining the POTUS and still be submissive? No, he can't. It will catch up one way or the other eventually. So consider, submission with a loving heart is love itself. And it's the ultimate point. If you consider Hebrews 5, verse 7, in the days of his incredible submission, offered up prayer and supplication with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. Okay? Jesus spoke to the authority over him and said, please don't make me do this thing. I don't want to, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth. I don't want to obey this. I don't want to do this. This is hard. He was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. And that is behavior, but that is also the approach, the attitude, the honorary ceremonial aspect of this. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And so the whole, Dad, I don't want to do this, don't worry, it builds your character. Right there. I mean, this is almost Jesus saying this to God, and God saying it builds your character. And being made perfect. Salvation to all who obey him. The discussion about obedience for us here. We who are supposed to obey him. If Jesus could obey God the Father and suffer this for us, we can follow that example. We can be submissive in the way that is required of us. So, I would encourage us, be submissive. Consider the ways that we can show our submission, not just through our behavior, which is the very least that is expected, but through our attitude. Because if we do not, eventually the behavior will start to fall apart as well. And therein lies sin. That is when sin starts to occur. I hope you've been encouraged, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.